Hello, and thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime, the podcast where we discuss cybercrimes and cybersecurity news. This week we'll be talking about a crazy phishing scheme that involved AI-generated fake South Korean military documents, journalists, researchers, and human rights activists. The North Korean threat actor group Kimsuki has started leveraging AI to help in spear phishing schemes. I talk a lot about phishing, but not too often about spear phishing. Spear phishing is a phishing method that is highly specific. It's tailored towards a certain target, making it seem more believable. A common way to spear phish is achieved by looking at something like someone's LinkedIn page and trying to send a phishing email related to something like their work, maybe a volunteer organization they work with, something that seems like it would be very reasonable for them to receive. In this case, the tactic was to establish a sense of authority and gain the trusts of journalists and activists by posing as South Korean military officials, by using fake AI-generated documents, which looked surprisingly realistic. Realistic enough to fool some of the victims. What also certainly helped was that the email address these were sent from ended with mli.kr, which did appear to be a common domain for a South Korean military email address. Though it is spelled slightly wrong, which is how a North Korean threat actor was able to use the domain without being in the South Korean military and just having an address like that. The documents were necessary for this because it was targeting a defense-related institution, and part of the phish requested that they review a draft of these identification documents. To review those documents, you had to click on a link, which downloaded a zip file. This is pretty normal for an email attachment, especially if it's either one larger file, or in this case, multiple different files in one folder. In the zip file, there were some very official-looking documents regarding issues in North Korea, including a report on some economic issues, and an investigations report on a crisis that occurred last year in South Korea, in which martial law was declared. With these documents and some official identification, it all still looked incredibly legitimate. However, one of the files was an LNK shortcut file, and when that was opened, that's when the machine was infected with malware. Impersonating a member of the South Korean military is obviously not super legal or ethical, and as a result, ChatGPT and most LLMs will generally refuse to do it. However, this is not always the case. AI can be manipulated into generating otherwise illegal or unethical content if the request is framed in a certain way, like in a fictional scenario or a mock-up or sample document. Prompt injection is a type of injection attack against large language models that can manipulate them into producing unintended results, like generating illicit or dangerous content, crafting custom malware, or even linking data from behind the scenes. A lot of people try to do this with chatbots that are supposed to be providing product support, for example. Like many other injection attacks, it can be mitigated with a few methods like input validation and output filtering. But LLMs are tricky to fix because they're very complicated, and they're programmed with a fault that is usually only found in humans rather than software. Large language models are programmed to make the end user satisfied with the results, so oftentimes it may bypass controls to do this when egged on enough by the humans manipulating it. Prompt injection is essentially social engineering for AI models, which is kind of crazy that that's a thing. We can now social engineer computers. Amazing. I generally caution people to be careful about the output of generative AI because it's almost always going to validate what you think or feel, even if that means producing fake results, which it often does. Hackers are now using this to their advantage to make phishing a lot easier. Now, don't get me wrong, this attack definitely could have, and probably would have happened without the use of generative AI. After all, phishing is definitely not a new AI thing. Photoshop exists as well, and many people are quite skilled in making forged documents. Usually, however, they can't create incredibly realistic ones in just a couple of minutes. I used to be decent at Photoshop, and it could take hours to make a decent-looking mock-up. By speeding up the process, more of the attacks can be formed a lot faster than if the documents had to be manually made by a human. You also probably would need to pay that human a lot of money to do that. Hopefully, as generative AI goes through its iterations and begins improving, we're going to see prompt injections less, though For now, I kind of doubt it and think we're still going to see this quite a bit for the near future. People are also going to make AI models that purposely don't have these kinds of protections against them, allowing you to still generate these fraudulent documents, and they're going to be used quite a lot by hackers. AI is really interesting to me from a technology ethics perspective because although it is a technology, you also need to kind of treat it like a person and teach it things that are acceptable to output and things that are not acceptable to output. So then, of course, there's questions like what is allowed and what isn't allowed. Especially if you're doing something maybe like writing code. What's the line between genuine software and malware? Because it's probably a lot blurrier than you actually think it is. These questions are all valuable for considering how one is supposed to remedy a vulnerability such as prompt injection. And that in itself is a question that I am not qualified to answer, because it's still a pretty new topic, and I'm certainly no AI genius. And I think it's still something that we're actively trying to fix now that the beast metaphorically has been released into the wild, and we can't take it back. Thank you to Dark Reading, InfoSecurity Magazine, and Bloomberg for information on this case. And of course, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime. And until next time, stay secure.